What are the conditional tenses? Well, this is a pretty complicated subject, so let's break down the purposes of the conditional tenses and how you can put them into practice. When speaking of hypothetical situations, we often frame actions based on one of three conditions. What would happen if we do something? What happens when we do something? And what happens if we did something? Based on these three conditions, the conditional tenses describe potential outcomes. What happens, what will might happen, what would might have happened. Special note, conditional tenses have at least two clauses. A subordinate clause, if or when, and an independent clause. It could potentially have more, but it'll have at least those two. And that means it's going to generally form what's known as a complex sentence, a subordinate clause and an independent clause. Now, there are actually 5 conditional types. The zero condition, the first, second, third, and mixed. The zero conditional tense usually applies to general truths that are current. What to look for in this context? The if and when, a subordinate clause in the simple present tense, simple present, and an independent clause that is also in simple present tense. What's that look like on our timeline? Well, we got the past, present, and future, and we have our subordinate clause and our independent clause. The subordinate clause has this condition, and that is placed in simple tense. The independent clause will also have the outcome of that condition in simple present. And the one causes the other. Example, when the bus is late, I get stuck in the rain. We have when here, which is a subordinate conjunction. So this means we have a subordinate clause. Within that context, we have is, which places that clause in a simple present, and then we have the word get, which places the independent clause also in the simple present tense. Let's take a look at this on our timeline. The subordinate clause involves us sitting at the bus stop when the bus is late. As a result of that, which is framed in the simple tense, we are going to get stuck in the rain. We're going to get stuck, and that also is in the simple present tense. In some cases, the independent and subordinate clause might be flipped around. In this example, we see the rain is only a problem. Independent clause, if, subordinate element, you do not want to get wet. We have the if, and this indicates that we have a subordinate clause. We have the is in the simple present for the independent clause. The rain is only a problem. And then we also have the simple present in the subordinate clause, want. Of course, we have put this in the negation, so do not want. It's in the negative, but it's still in simple present. So both clauses in simple present with the subordinate clause that has an impact on the independent. On our timeline, we begin with the independent clause. The rain is only a problem, what? In simple tense, if, simple tense, you don't want to get wet. The first conditional tense describes a potentially real future situation and its likely outcome. What to look for in this context? Our subordinate element, beginning with if or when, a subordinate clause in simple present tense, and an independent clause in simple future tense. Both of them will remain simple, even though one is in the present and the other is in the future. How does this look on our timeline? We have the past, present, and future. We have a subordinate clause and an independent clause. Our subordinate clause is in the present, simple, and it will have an impact on a future simple event. So here we see that present simple tense is impacting the future simple tense. Example, if the bus is late, I will miss class. We begin with our subordinate element if. That shows that that's a subordinate clause. Within that subordinate clause, we have is in simple present. And then in our independent clause, we have will miss in the simple future tense. So the simple present conditional element, the subordinate element, will have an impact in the future. Let's visualize this in the timeline again. We've got our subordinate clause and our independent clause. If the bus is late, simple present tense, then that will have an impact on the independent clause. I will miss class, and that will be simple future tense. And again, that simple present action is having an impact on the future. Another example, if you mess with the bull, you will get the horns. Again, here we have the subordinate conjunction, if, which shows that we have a subordinate clause. Within that clause, we have mess, which is the simple present. And within the independent clause, we have will get, the simple future. Let's take a look at that on the timeline. If you mess with the bull, simple present, you will get the horns, simple future. And again, we have that simple present element having an impact on the simple future event. All right, now we're on to the second conditional tense, which is used to express an unrealistic or unlikely outcome that's the result of an imagined scenario. Now, what to look for in this context? We're going to have the if or when. We need that subordinate element. That subordinate element will be in simple past tense. We're going to have an independent clause in simple present tense, and that gets paired with a auxiliary modal verb. I know what you're thinking. What is the modal verb? So we got a special note here. Modal verbs are auxiliary verbs that convey the possibility or likelihood of an action. And there are 9 of them in total. Must, may, might, could, can, should, shall, would, and will. Now, these are a little complicated, so if you want to learn more about the modals, check out our video on the modal verbs. Only modals in the building. Now, let's see what that second conditional tense looks like on our timeline. We got the past, present, future. We got our subordinate clause. We got our independent clause. In the past, we're going to have that subordinate element, an imagined or unrealistic scenario, and it will be in simple past. That's going to have an impact on a present event, a simple present event. So again, that past event impacting directly the outcome of that present event. Example, if buses always arrived on time, my boss would yell at me less often. So here we have if, which shows again, this is a subordinate clause. We have arrived, simple past tense. In the subordinate clause, we have would with the modal verb, and then we have yell, simple present. So again, we have that past event, unrealistic or unlikely, having an impact on the present. Let's take a look at how this would be visualized on our timeline. The subordinate element, if the bus always arrived on time, simple past. My boss would yell at me less often. Simple present with the modal attached. Again, that past event having a direct impact on the present event. Another example, if I had $1 million, I would buy you a fur coat, but not a real fur coat. That's cruel, as our good friend, the Bare Naked Ladies would say. Now again, in this context, we have if, and that shows that we have a subordinate clause. Within that subordinate clause, we have a simple past tense verb, had. And in the independent clause, we have that modal, would, showing the likelihood or possibility, and the word by in the simple present tense, indicating that if that unrealistic past event had happened, we would be doing this in the present. How does this show up on our timeline? Well, the subordinate clause, winning the $1 million, in simple past tense, unlikely event, and that has an impact on the present. We buy you a fur coat, but not a real fur coat. simple present with the modal, and that past event is having an impact directly on the present event. The third conditional tense describes how a past outcome would change if an action before it had been different. So what are we going to look for here? Again, we need the if or when to show that we have a subordinate clause. In that subordinate clause or clauses, we'll have the past perfect tense, a past perfect tense. That will be paired with an independent clause in present perfect, a present perfect tense. And again, we're going to have one of those fancy auxiliary modal verbs. The third conditional tense. Let's check out our timeline here. We got past, present, and future, and we have, of course, our subordinate clause and our independent clause. In the subordinate clause, we have a past event that took place before another past event. And that event, because it takes place before another event, is in the perfect past tense. If you want to learn more about the perfect modes in past, present, and future, check out our video on the perfect mood. All right. Now, that past event, the first one, has an impact on another past event, which is in our independent clause and has continued to the present, or has an impact on the present. And this is what it's going to look like visually. Let's take a look at an example. If the bus had been on time, comma, I would have been present for class. We have two past events. We have if, which shows that this is a subordinate clause, and we have had been as the verb in there, shows that it's past perfect, an action that took place before another past action. In our independent clause, we have the modal, would, and then we have been, which shows an action that took place in the past and continued to or has an impact on the present. All right, now let's take a look at this on our timeline. We've got the subordinate clause and the independent clause. If the bus had been on time, and this is the past event that took place before another past event, you would have been in class. And because there's a past event before another past event, we use the perfect past tense. Now, as a result of being in class, that past event has an impact on the present, because now you would have done better in the class. You would have got your A+. So as a result of that, we use the perfect present for the independent clause. Let's take a look at another example. If Cardi B had been a fitness instructor, she could have called herself Cardi O. All right, so we have if, which shows that this is a subordinate clause. We have the words had been in the past perfect. And then in the independent clause, we have could, which is a modal verb, of course. And then we have called, which puts this in the present perfect, a past event that continues until or has an impact on the present. Let's take a look at this on our timeline. The subordinate clause, the celebrated hip-hop star Cardi B, unrealistically becomes a fitness instructor in the past instead of a hip-hop icon. Now, that is a past event. It takes place before another past event, and that is the naming of her celebrity self. And because this past event, becoming a fitness instructor, occurs before the naming of herself, it's put in the past perfect. Now, that has an impact on another past event. Instead of calling herself Cardi B, she calls herself Cardi O, and that has an impact or continues until the present. Therefore, it is put in present perfect. All right, the mixed conditional tense. The mixed conditional tenses describe an imagined past or present context that has implications with respect to the present. In the past, we've seen that we're either using simple or perfect tenses. With the mixed conditionals, we use different moods, and that's one of the key differences between them. So, what to look for? We're going to have the if or when, as we've had for all the other instances, a subordinate clause in simple or perfect past tense, and then an independent clause in perfect or simple tense. We alternate between the simple and perfect in the two clauses. Plus a modal verb. Of course, we've got to throw in one of those fancy modals. Now. So let's take a look at what a mixed conditional tense would look like on our timeline. Past, present, and future. And we also have the subordinate and independent clause. The subordinate clause has a past event that took place before another past event. The independent clause has a current event. And in this context, the past event that occurred before another past event has an impact on the present. Now, the question here is, why is this considered a mixed conditional? The answer, there's different tense moods. In the past, as we mentioned, everything was either in perfect or simple, but we have the subordinate clause in perfect tense and the independent clause in simple. Therefore, it is mixed. Now, this isn't the only option for the mixed conditional. We could have this flipped around. So let's take a look at the other example. In the subordinate clause, we have a simple past event, simple past, and that has an impact in the simple past on another past event that has continued to the present or has an impact on the present. And therefore, that present tense verb will be put in present perfect. And again, the two will be in conflict or contrast with each other because one is simple and one is perfect. Let's take a look at an example with perfect past and simple present. If the bus had been on time, I would be at the Blackpink concert. All right, so in this context, we have if, which creates a subordinate clause here. We have had been, which is in past perfect. And now in this context, the person speaking in first person would, theoretically, based on our modal tense, be at the Blackpink concert in the present moment. Let's take a look at this on our timeline. If the bus had been on time, now the bus would be in time before the start of the Blackpink concert. So this past event is taking place before another past event. That means we're in the perfect past. And that has an impact on me right now, because if this bus had been on time, then I would be at the Blackpink concert at this very moment. Therefore, we use simple present for the independent clause. Now let's take a look where we flip that around. Simple past, perfect present. If you looked out for me, comma, I could have been a contender. Now in this context, we have if, which shows that this is a subordinate clause. And within that subordinate clause, we have the simple past. If you looked out for me in the past, did this simple action, then I could, in the modal, potentially have been, putting this in the present perfect, a contender. And that would have an impact on the present, because rather than working on the docks, this person would be a retired boxing champion. All right, let's break this down. Subordinate, if you looked out for me, simple past. I could have been a contender. I could have been contending, and that would have an impact going forward because your reputation, or his reputation rather, would be different now than it is. Therefore, it would be in the perfect present tense. All right, let's do a quick summary. We have the zero conditional tense, the first, second, and third conditional tenses, as well as the two mixed conditional tenses. In the zero conditional tense, that applies to current general truths. And in that context, we're just going to have both clauses in simple present tense. When it rains, it pours. All right, so whenever it's raining, it comes down a lot. Present, simple, both. First conditional describes a potential future situation and likely outcome. Subordinate clause will be in simple present. The independent clause will be in simple future. Example, if you mess with the bull in the present tense, you will get the horns in the future tense. So don't mess with that bull. The second conditional tense conveys outcomes that result from imagined scenarios. In this context, the simple past will be used in the subordinate clause. The independent clause will use a conditional simple present. Example, if I had $1 million, I would buy a K car. So if I had in the past, simple past, I would, simple present, buy a K car. Nice Reliant automobile. And then the third describes how past outcomes would differ if actions had differed. In this context, a subordinate clause is in past perfect and the independent clause is in conditional present perfect. If Cardi B had been a fitness instructor, had been, past perfect. She could have called herself cardio, conditional present perfect. And I'm sure cardio, or rather Cardi B, gets a kick out of that one. Then we have our two mixed conditional tenses. One describes an imagined past or present context that impact the present. The subordinate clause in past perfect, an independent clause in conditional simple present. So if I had studied, so doing the studying before the test, I would be better prepared. Assuming that you're writing the test in that moment, you would use the simple present. Had studied for the test, I would be better prepared. All right, and we have our very studious dog, who of course always studies before his tests. And we have the final mixed, which is the alternative mixed conditional clause with a subordinate clause in simple past and an independent clause that uses the present perfect. Example, if you looked out for me, past simple, I could have been. So could have been a contender, and that would be in the present perfect. Wow, there's a lot of information to go over there. So if you have any questions, drop them in the comments section below, and we'll be sure to get to them as soon as possible. You will have noticed that we referred to simple and perfect tenses throughout this presentation. If you have any questions about how the moods operate, the simple, perfect, progressive, also called continuous, and the perfect progressive, check out our videos on those, and we'll also have a video on modals. So check those out, but again, drop your questions below, and until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.